So I talked a little bit about how with the blood glucose roller coaster, we have high levels of insulin, and how that over time can lead to insulin resistance. So the little black circles are supposed to be cells, and then the little yellow dots are energy sources or sugar. And what we see in insulin resistance is that it's essentially an overfed state where we have too much stored energy. And even though there's a lot of energy and glucose circulating around, the body does not want to absorb anymore, or the cells do not. So an easy way to think about it is that it's essentially carbohydrate intolerance. So with lower glucose, lower carbohydrate intake, we end up having these lower insulin levels, and this really helps with our insulin resistance. In addition, there's a separate mechanism if we're in ketosis, where the ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, appears to help improve kind of that glucose metabolism in and of itself, both through lowering kind of the oxidative stress and through a fancy word called histone deacetylase. Anyway, it just helps the glucose metabolism. So in type 2 diabetes, we know that insulin resistance is the underlying issue. So if we look at the chart, we see that when we have higher carbohydrate intake, we end up having this blood glucose spike with also, the large bolus of insulin. But when we keep our dietary carbohydrates below the level where they turn to fat, when we keep our blood sugar stable, we see improvements in the signs and symptoms of insulin resistance. So I also wanted to talk a minute about metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is very common. It's when you have 3 out of 5 criteria. It's high triglycerides, low HDL, large waist, elevated blood pressure, and insulin resistance. But the real driver in metabolic syndrome are these high levels of insulin over time. So when we go on a low-carb or ketogenic plan, our insulin levels lower, and we see resolution of a lot of these symptoms. So I wanted to share briefly a patient of mine that I presented with Dr. Westman at an obesity medicine conference years ago now. But it was a gentleman who came in with very high blood sugars, 400s, 500s. And he had all metabolic syndrome, high inflammation, and an A1C of 18.6, measured 3 times. And we put him, he didn't want to do injected insulin. I was fairly new, right out of residency, and I think I called Dr. Westman. I'm like, what should I do? And he suggested I put him on this ketogenic plan. And we did, and this patient did amazingly well. Over the next few weeks, his blood sugars normalized. His blood pressures, he was on 3 medications for blood pressures, and they were still in the 160s, 180s. They came down into normal ranges. And over the next few months, we see his blood glucose normalize with an A1C of 6, so 18.6 to 6. Which was pretty phenomenal, especially without the use of injected insulin. So how could low carbohydrate nutrition work for inflammation? Well, we know it minimizes insulin release. In Dr. Finney and Volek's book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, they talk about how these high levels of insulin in and of itself can cause inflammation. We see with these high levels of insulin, higher reactive oxygen species and free radicals. And these free radicals often attack what's nearby, convenient targets, which is often the cell membrane, which is composed of polyunsaturated fats. And so when these polyunsaturated fats, these cell membranes, undergo oxidative stress, they don't function as well. And we see more inflammation. Dr. Finney and Volek talk about how in studies of low fat versus low carb, where the low fat has higher insulin levels and the low carb has lower insulin levels, we see markers of inflammation fall significantly in those on the low-carb diet. So I spoke a minute, the last few slides have all been about low-carb and ketogenic. The next slides are only about ketogenic. So continuing on with inflammation. So we know that ketosis works for inflammation, but how does it work? Well, it turns out when you have these ketones, they directly interact with a transcription factor called NF-kappa B. I don't know what it stands for. But NF-kappa B leads to many downstream inflammatory effects. And these inflammatory effects cause systemic inflammation throughout the body. Additionally, the NF-kappa B works on something called the NLRP inflammasome. Just from the name, you can tell it's going to be inflammatory, right? So with the inflammasome, we see other kind of downstream inflammatory effects. Now, the inflammasome is important in our innate immune system. But when we have chronic conditions like diabetes and metabolic syndrome, the inflammasome is overreactive. It's producing too many inflammatory cytokines. And so what happens is, with ketosis, we block this NLRP3 inflammasome, and we block NF-kappa B. So we're actually blocking it from two separate mechanisms. So I wanted to talk to you about how ketosis works in seizures, because that was one of the first areas that was really studied. And it turns out how it works for seizures is actually a great model for how it works in other areas as well, other common conditions. So when we follow a ketogenic plan, we actually activate potassium channels, which doesn't mean a whole lot, except that it means it stabilizes our synaptic function. It decreases the excitability. And this is important because in seizures, we have hyperexcitability of the neurons. We also, in ketogenic nutrition, get decreased reactive oxygen species. So we know just by following low carb, we get lower reactive oxygen species or lower free radicals. But it turns out through a separate mechanism, when you're in ketosis, you also decrease these free radicals. And lastly, we get increased, this is a fancy word, mitochondrial biogenesis. So mitochondria are the powerhouses of your cells. They create the energy, the ATP. And biogenesis just means to create. So we get more of this energy, higher energy reserves. And with higher energy reserves, we have improved synaptic function. And this leads to increased GABA. And GABA is another neurotransmitter that helps to stabilize our synaptic function further and prevent that hyperexcitability. So to summarize that very confusing slide, with ketosis, we have improved energy availability both through the increased mitochondria as well as the increased beta-hydroxybutyrate. We have decreased excitability both through the potassium channels and the increased GABA. And we have less oxidative damage. We have fewer free radicals and reactive oxygen species. So now that we've gone through the model of seizures, what I'd like to show is how some of these mechanisms work in other conditions. So depression is a really common condition I see in my practice. And it's thought to be due to kind of low overall energy. When we're in ketosis, we get beneficial changes in the brain energy profile. Remember that mitochondrial biogenesis, as well as the direct energy available from ketones. Additionally, ketones cause a decrease in the intracellular sodium concentration, which is a common property we see in all mood stabilizers. So Alzheimer's is a very complex disease, and it's probably actually many diseases. But one form of Alzheimer's is thought to be like a type 3 diabetes. And this is kind of the theory of how ketogenic nutrition works in Alzheimer's. The thought is that with decades of high sugar nutrition, our neurons become insulin resistant. And with that insulin resistance, they can't use the glucose very well, and they have a cellular energy failure. In addition, we talked about how with insulin resistance, we get increased reactive oxygen species, increased free radicals. And over time, these two things together combine, creating oxidative damage and a lack of fuel, resulting in cell death and dysfunction. So how could ketosis work in Alzheimer's? Well, we know that if there is an energy deficit, ketosis seems to be helpful at a neuronal level. We see both the ketone bodies, like beta-hydroxybutyrate, being able to provide energy, and we also know there's that mitochondrial biogenesis, which can help. We also see less oxidative damage. There are fewer reactive oxygen species and free radicals. And there are studies going on kind of looking at ketogenic nutrition and Alzheimer's. There's a UCLA researcher named Dale Bredesen who's done a lot of research in this area. He has a book called The End of Alzheimer's, and in his research he uses something called the KetoFlex diet, which is not fully ketogenic, but it's pretty close, where he uses this in patients with pretty impressive results. So ketosis and cancer. This is a very complex topic. It's mainly, as far as cancers where it's been seen to help, there's a lot of work around glioblastoma multiforme, which is a brain cancer. The thought is this: normal cells can use ketones for energy, ketones like beta-hydroxybutyrate, but cancerous cells cannot. They need that glucose. So when you starve the environment of glucose, you selectively damage the cancer cells, allowing the healthy cells to thrive. And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, but there is some promising research being done. So ketosis and migraines. Migraines are another common thing that I see in my practice. Migraines are thought to be related to low energy, sterile inflammation, and often triggered by that blood glucose roller coaster. When we're in ketosis, we certainly do not have the blood glucose roller coaster. We lower inflammation, and we provide energy through other means. So chronic pain. Chronic pain is thought to be related to hyperexcitable neurons and increased inflammation. So let's think back to the epilepsy model. The hyperexcitable neurons can be calmed down by both those potassium channels and the increased GABA. And with the inflammation, we know that when someone's in ketosis, we're blocking NF-kappa B, that NLRP3 inflammasome, and we have less reactive oxygen species. So I wanted to share with you a patient of mine that had some of these conditions that we've talked about. This was a 40-year-old woman. She came in with severe chronic daily pain. She had fatty liver with enzymes in the 300s, high inflammation markers. She had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, interstitial cystitis, and IBS. She was taking IV Orencia, Neurontin, Cymbalta, and Voltaren. However, despite all these medications, she was in so much pain. She didn't feel like she had a life. And so we started her on a systems-based approach, a lifestyle approach, and that included a ketogenic diet for her. And it was really one of the more touching, spectacular things I've seen. Her liver enzymes normalized fairly quickly. Her symptoms of IBS and interstitial cystitis improved. But for her, the biggest improvement was the chronic pain. For the first time in 8 years, she didn't have pain. And to me, that's pretty amazing. So I mentioned I wanted to speak a minute about a systems-based approach. Well, we know that most dysfunction, most disease, is not a function of your genetics. It's really a function of your lifestyle and your environment. And I'd like to show a quick video on how I think we can use a systems-based approach to improve people's health. Is that loud enough? Can you guys hear it? No? Darn. All right. Is there anyone with AV that can help?
You're playing a video?
Mm-hmm. Can you make it louder?
Yeah, so it's coming out of there because we didn't know you had it.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, I can put the microphone, that's the only thing I can do right now.
Oh. All right. All right, so here's the systems-based approach video. Is that better?
In the 1950s, diabetes were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so it called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria dropped down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people collapsed on their heads. Turns out that DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasp that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of diabetic people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT infected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon, the diabetic people were back on the phone with the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time, though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into formula. Operation Cat Rock was courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
All right, so what does this mean and how does it relate to medicine? Well, when we take ready-made solutions, such as the DDT, we often get a big bottle of side effects with that. Think about when people try to treat high blood pressure and they don't address lifestyle issues, and all they do is give a blood pressure medicine. So I want to ask you, what do you think the best way to optimize tens of thousands of genes, improve protein networks, minimize inflammation, improve cell signal transduction factors, and change the expression of biology? I'll give you a hint, it's not in the picture. It's food. Food is information. It's code. It's beyond calories. It's the code that upregulates and downregulates your biologic software with every bite. And I think with food, we can make a difference, and we can heal each other. Thank you for having me.